All right, welcome to chapter 28, all about the protists. So I'm going to do a little introduction to protists. Now, protists can be small, but they can also be very large. Now, using, of course, a microscope will allow us to identify most of the small ones, of course, in just water, right? So if you actually took a drop of pond water, you would probably identify at least 3 to 4 protists. Now, protist is actually an informal name of a group. Used to be called really a kingdom, but it's not a true kingdom, and we're going to kind of express that as we go through this particular chapter, and it'll be a common trend as we go through the rest of the chapters in the semester. Now, they're not all of them are unicellular. Okay, so here most of them are unicellular, meaning only one cell, and all of them are eukaryotes. Now, advances in the ability to actually study and classify these in that area of science called systematics had allowed us to basically change these relationships and the phylogeny of protists quite significantly over the most recent years. Now, as I mentioned, the protists are not a true kingdom, so they're not a monophyletic group. They're actually a polyphyletic group. They're a polyphyletic group because when we look at the phylogeny, you're going to see that plants fall into their entire phylogeny. So do animals, and that includes us, right? And also fungi. So this is why it's no longer a true kingdom. But it is a group of organisms that many of them just kind of fall into that if they don't belong to any of the other true kingdoms. Now, most of these, all of them are eukaryotes. Most eukaryotes are single-celled organisms. Now, we are quite rare, so are most animals. But most eukaryotes are going to be single-celled organisms. Eukaryotic cells, remember the difference between eukaryotic cells and prokaryotic cells? Eukaryotic cells have organelles and they're a lot more complex. And of course, the individual cells are larger than prokaryotic cells as well. Now, it's important to remember that organisms in most eukaryotic lineages are actually protists, right? So protist is quite a very, very large group of organisms, a group of eukaryotic organisms. And again, most protists are going to be unicellular. Some of them, even though they're unicellular, they live in a colonial type lifestyle, so they kind of live together. And then, of course, there are some multicellular organisms or protists. Now, protists probably display the most diversity in terms of structure and function than any other group of eukaryotes. So they're quite diverse, and we're going to see some examples as you go through each of the major segments. Now, this shows some of the diversity of protists. So you can see some of them. These are actually pseudopodia. They're stiff like rods shaped pseudopodia. And then we've got these trumpet-shaped protists, and then we've got very small spherical-shaped, and then more oblong-type protists. And then, look, this looks like a flower, and this looks actually like a plant, right? So there are all different types of structure, and of course, each of them have their own individual functions as well. Now, let's talk about this structural and functional diversity in protists. Now, protists, they are probably the most diverse regarding their nutritional categories. Um, so they are, some of them are photoautotrophs, meaning that they use sunlight or light for energy, and then they use carbon-containing, not organic compounds, right? So they're going to be like carbon dioxide or bicarbonate for their carbon source. And then some of them are heterotrophs, right? Most likely chemoheterotrophs. So that would be obtaining organic chemicals from external sources and then using that for energy and a carbon source. Some of them combine the two. Some of them are mixotrophs. So this might have been something that you looked up for the previous chapter, and this is kind of in preparation for this. So mixotrophs actually combine photosynthesis and heterotrophic nutrition, and they can switch between the two often. Now, in terms of reproduction, they reproduce sexually or asexually. Now, not all protists do both, right? So it's that or that, and then of course there's conjugation, which is considered genetic recombination. So these are the three forms of sexual reproduction, and again, these types of reproduction are included in some various protists. Remember, they're all quite diverse. Now, it is thought that endosymbiosis has brought about such diversity in the protists. Now, and the evidence kind of shows this, right? So, endosymbiosis, remember, it's a relationship between two species in which one organism has been engulfed or lives inside the cell of another organism. So we have the symbiont, which would be the organism that lives inside, and then of course the organism that lives inside is going to live inside a host. Now, this is thought to be the origin of the mitochondrion and the chloroplast, but also the origin of diversity in protists. Now, let's look at the diversity of protists here in this overall phylogeny. So if we take a look at this, we can see, look, this would be the ancestor of all protists here. We can see it divides up into four major supergroups, which again will be the subject of the additional four segments. We have the excavata, which include the diplomonads, the parabasalids, and the euglenozoans. And then the SAR group, which is a very large group. It includes the straminophiles, the alveolates, and the rosarians. The straminophiles include the diatoms, the golden algae, and the brown algae. The alveolates include the dinoflagellates, the apicomplexans, and the ciliates. And the rosarians include the radiolarians, the forams, and the cercozoans. Then we have the major group or supergroup Archaeplastida, which includes the red algae and the green algae, which divide into two major groups, which include the chlorophytes and the charophytes. And it's the charophytes that are most closely related to plants. And you can see plants go in here, and this is why it is a polyphyletic group, or one of the reasons why. And then we have the Uniconta, which include the major or subgroup amoebozoans and the epistloconts. The amoebozoans include the slime molds, the tubulinids, and the entamoebas, and the epistloconts include the nuclearids, which are the direct ancestors of fungi, and the choanoflagellates, which are direct ancestors or sister species of animals. So we'll look at some of the characteristics of each of these within each of the individual segments. Okay, so like I said, the much of the diversity of protist comes from endosymbiotic origins. So we're going to talk about endosymbiosis. Now, endosymbiosis can occur primarily, but also primary endosymbiosis resulted in the diverse types of algae, right? So we have the red algae and the green algae. So what actually happened and what primary endosymbiosis is basically there is an ancestral eukaryote which didn't have any of these organelles in them. An ancestral eukaryote engulfed a cyanobacterium. And again, it's a cyanobacterium which is thought to be the origin of the chloroplast. So now we have a cyanobacterium which has been engulfed, and of course, over time, it starts to change. So in this case, it's lost. Remember, the chloroplast has two layers, right, or two membranes. Well, it loses one of the membranes, and then it becomes an alga, which has a chloroplast within it. So here we have this ancestor, right? So over time it changes, and now we have, divergence here. We have the red alga and the green alga. Secondary endosymbiosis occurs after the divergence of the algae, right? So we have in red alga here, which was then engulfed by another ancestral eukaryote, which didn't have any organelles previously. So here we have the whole organism, which was the result of primary endosymbiosis being engulfed which is now secondary endosymbiosis. And this gives rise to the straminopiles and the alveolates. Now, of course, because this occurred with the red alga, the green alga undergoes. Just like the red alga, the green alga underwent secondary endosymbiosis as well. So remember, the green alga is the product of primary endosymbiosis. And then the green alga was engulfed by actually two different ancestral eukaryotes, which gives rise to the euglenids. So we can see the euglenids right here. They have a flagella. And then the chloroarachnophytes, which are quite different. They do not have a flagellum. They do have pseudopodia. If we tie this all together, we can see we have the primary endosymbiosis, which again gives rise to the red alga and the green alga, and then the secondary endosymbiosis, which gives rise to four different major groups of protists, which again further divide into other groups as well. So we'll go ahead and talk about those again a little bit more in detail in the segments, which are going to be separate from this discussion. Let's talk a little bit more about prokaryotes in terms of ecology. So prokaryotes, again, they're quite diverse in terms of structure, but also their environments. So they live in quite diverse aquatic environments and also terrestrial environments. Protists do play two key roles in their habitats. So they can be a symbiont. Okay, so they can actually be in a relationship with, another organism within the habitat, and they can also be producers. And whenever an organism is basically considered a producer, that means it can photosynthesize. So we can see that some protists can photosynthesize, and some of them cannot. Now, symbiotic protists, right? So some of them can benefit their hosts. Here are some examples, and we'll see these examples when we get to the segments. So we have the dinoflagellates. Those actually help nourish the coral, the polyps that build reefs. And then we have those protists that can digest wood, which inhabit the gut of termites. Now, there, of course, some are parasitic, right? So, again, most of them that are considered parasitic are usually pathogenic, so they cause some sort of disease. Now, that's not always the case. However, most of these examples are examples that are those that are pathogenic. So we have the Plasmodium falciparum, which actually causes malaria. And then we have an actual dinoflagellate. So not all dinoflagellates are beneficial, right? So some of them can cause disease. So some dinoflagellates can kill very large quantities of fish. Some of them can cause disease in plants, right? So we have a couple examples right here, sudden oak death and potato blight, or potato late blight, which both of these affected plants. And of course, when we have diseases in plants, it affects those organisms that are dependent on plants for food. Now, the producer protists, of course, are going to be ones that can photosynthesize. So they're able to take the sunlight and convert it to convert carbon dioxide, which is a gas, into organic compounds for energy. Photosynthetic protists are limited, of course, by the nutrients that are present, and also populations of photosynthetic protists can explode when limiting nutrients are added. So here we can see the relationship between many different types of protists. Now, I didn't talk about many of these individual ones, but we know some of them are part of plankton, so they are herbivorous. And then we have the prokaryotic producers, which contribute to the plankton. We have the protist producers, which contribute to the plankton, and the consumers like us and other organisms. And then the herbivorous plankton are going to contribute to the carnivorous plankton. And then, of course, the carnivorous plankton and the herbivorous plankton contribute to the consumers in one way or another. So you can see there's a tight-knit relationship between all different types of organisms. And protists are really at the center of it. They are quite important. Now, it's important to talk about this in terms of their life cycle. So, um, the alternation of generations represents the life cycle of some protists, and we're going to be talking about the alternation of generations when we move into plants and, of course, animals and fungi. Now, what the alternation of generation is basically the alternation between two generations of the life cycle. So often it can be related to the number of chromosomes. So remember, we have gametes, which have half as much chromosomes as us, as a full organism. So it's basically alternating between haploid and diploid stages. Now, there are two types of alternation of generations. There are heteromorphic and there's isomorphic. Hetero and iso, okay, so hetero means different. So this means that the two generations, haploid and diploid, are structurally different, so they appear different. The isomorphic alternation of generations, the two generations within this type of life cycle, are very similar structurally. Now, the diploid generation is often called the sporophyte because it produces spores. The haploid generation is often called the gametophyte because it produces gametes. Now, there's a difference between spores and gametes. They are not the same. Now, let's look at the alternation of generations of a brown alga. So remember, the brown alga is one of those that looks like plants. It's actually a plant. It's considered a plant-like protist. However, it's not a plant because evidence has suggested that it doesn't belong to the plant kingdom. So we can see the sporophyte and the gametophyte here. The sporophyte is diploid and the gametophyte is haploid. The sporophyte is diploid, and under these spores, or the sporocytes, which are cells that undergo meiosis to produce the spores. Okay, so they're going to produce the spores. Here, for the brown alga, they're called zoospores, and they have flagella. Not all spores have flagella, and it's important to note that, and this is going to be a common theme, those spores that have flagella, those types of organisms typically live in wet environments because, of course, the spores and the gametes, if they have flagella, also require water so that they can swim. So here we have the zoospores. And the spores are going to generate into either haploid or either male or female gametophytes. And remember, the gametophyte is haploid. The zoospores are haploid after meiosis. So these are going to germinate and create haploid cells or multicellular structures, which are all haploid. So this occurs by mitosis. And then the gametophytes are going to produce the sperm. So here we can see the sperm also have flagella. They're going to swim and find the egg and the female gametophyte. And then, of course, will occur, and this will generate the sporophyte. So this cycle continues over and over again. Now, as we go through the semester, many of these alternation of generations are going to get quite a bit more complex. So it's kind of important that you understand this process now. It'll make it a lot easier on yourself later. Now, this is just a summary here. I did talk about the protists in terms of the diversity. They are diverse in size, shape, and lifestyles, nutritional categories. Now I think you're ready for the segments of the supergroups. Thank you for listening.